Welcome to a KSAT live stream. We're talking about the very latest on the Suzanne Simpson case. I'm Myra Arthur, joined here by Dylan Collier. Yesterday, we got this arrest warrant detailing the evidence that police believe they have to charge Suzanne's husband, Brad Simpson, with murder. It filled in a lot of gaps, a lot of questions that we have had about this case, because although he has been in jail for weeks, it wasn't until that murder charge came last week that he was actually tied to, investigators believe, his wife's disappearance.
The Texas Rangers, Olmos Park Police, even the FBI, which we weren't aware of until this warrant was released, have spent weeks sort of piecing this timeline together from the late evening of October 6th until now, quite frankly. I mean, there's been developments in this case over just the last couple of weeks, and they did a pretty good job of recovering surveillance video, everything from license plate readers to surveillance cameras that were at another local police department that saw her going to a friend's home the night of October 6th. So they've done a pretty good job of putting together a timeline of where he went, what supplies he had with him while he was traveling to those places. I mean, we're talking about several counties, Bexar County, Kendall County, Bandera County. What they do not have at this point, and it's a very critical piece of all this, is confirmation that they've recovered Suzanne's remains.
Yeah, investigators have said they have no indication, no signs of life from her since October 6th. That's where this all begins. That's the last night that she was seen. There was a fight between the couple at the Argyle. That's a private social club in the Alamo Heights area. Then October 7th is when she is reported missing. Now, up until this warrant was released yesterday, we understood that Brad Simpson, her husband, was the one who first reported her missing. We've learned that that's not actually the case.
This was a friend of Suzanne's, reported Suzanne missing just before 10 p.m. She had spoken to Brad earlier in the evening and expressed concern about Suzanne's well-being. It was about 15 minutes after the friend called 911 to report Suzanne missing that Brad Simpson made his own report, left a voicemail of some kind that he was not sure where his wife was, and there was some concern about her whereabouts.
And this warrant details that when investigators talked to him, he showed little emotion. It says he seemed unconcerned that his wife was missing. But you mentioned the surveillance video, and it's what that video shows at a Whataburger drive-thru that seems to be a big piece of evidence in this case.
Yeah, and there's this question about supplies that he bought. He had a blue tarp that appeared to have some sort of object underneath the tarp, and then this firewood rack on top of the tarp to keep the object in place. That was in his truck for a number of hours. He travels from San Antonio up through Kendall County into Bandera County, and then comes back. And just based on the timeline that we've been able to put together, 11:15 a.m., the blue tarp is still in the back of his truck. 1:41 p.m., they have additional surveillance footage of him coming back into Boerne from Bandera County, and the blue tarp is no longer there. So I think that's a very critical piece of this timeline. 11:15 a.m. to 1:41 p.m. He appears to have been in Bandera County at that point. The tarp was with him when he went up there. It was not with him when he came back.
We know that this says that, using phone records, investigators saw that he was turning his phone on and off at some point.
Lockdown mode, they call it. Yeah.
Lockdown mode, yeah. So it's that gap in that timeline on October 7th from 11:15 a.m. to 1:41 p.m. We don't know what happened there. The 11:15 time was the last time that blue tarp was seen. 1:41. It was no longer in the truck.
No longer in the truck. So that gives you a little over 2 hours in a rural Texas county. Very important that at some point investigators piece together what occurred between 11:15 a.m. and 1:41 p.m.
Okay. Big questions not only about where Suzanne Simpson's remains are, but what is this new information? What does this evidence now do for the prosecution and both the defense of this case? So we're going to bring in somebody to talk about that. We have Marissa Giovinco joining us here in the newsroom for this live stream. Former prosecutor, current defense attorney. We appreciate you being here.
Of course.
So let's talk about your reaction to this information. What do you think it does for the prosecution of a case like this?
There's a lot of facts that police were able to uncover that are very circumstantial to what happened to Suzanne. Circumstantial evidence is big in a trial. It leads to suspicion, right? We're all thinking this doesn't sound good. So that will be big in proving this case without the body of Suzanne.
You mentioned the section of the warrant that talks about the personal banker at Frost Bank, and this was included in the warrant to arrest Brad Simpson for murder. May not necessarily be something that we see if this goes to trial. Why is that?
Correct. So an affidavit for an arrest warrant is hearsay. It's based on the officer's statements, in paper or on paper to the judge. However, not everything in an arrest warrant is admissible in trial.
So this is, and the evidence you're referring to is some of the testimony from that banker, Suzanne Simpson's personal banker. She told her sometime back in August of this year that she was a victim of abuse, that Brad Simpson, she said, would repeatedly take her cell phone away from her, and that if something were to happen to her, go look for her in a lake. That is chilling to hear that happened. That conversation happened months ago, and then fast forward to October 6th, the last time she's seen. But you're saying that doesn't necessarily mean that evidence would ever make it to a trial.
Correct, because that is statements that were made outside of the courtroom and by someone who is not available to testify. It is hearsay, and without an exception, it's not coming in. In fact, I don't think it's likely to come in, even if the banker were to testify. As a prosecutor, I'd want that in. It's very damning evidence. It's important. However, I don't know that it comes in.
Prosecutors dismissed the lower charges against Brad Simpson. These are the ones that he was originally arrested for in Bernie and then held in the Bexar County Jail on until they were able to get the murder warrant. Why would they take that step? Is it so they can focus more on just the murder case, or why set the smaller charges aside?
Sure. So I think possibly something that comes into play is that there's a timeline. When someone is in custody, they have 90 days to indict them with the charges they're in custody on, or they could be released. He has been in custody for some time, and now they've got a new charge, so that clock will start over on the new charge. So that buys them some more time. That's a possibility. They also can put the lower charges, combine them in the same indictment, the same charging document as the murder charge. They can take it all to a grand jury at the same time.
So while we're reviewing all these details, again, we still don't know where her body is. And that's something that we've talked to you about in the past. How do you prosecute a case like this without having a body? Do you think that what's spelled out in this warrant is enough to overcome that?
That's something only a jury can decide, because this is going to be a very complicated case for a state to prove. And as a defense attorney, it's very circumstantial, because while all of the circumstantial evidence suggests that Suzanne is no longer living, how do we know? How do we know she's not alive? How do we know she didn't run off and to escape her, the abuse that he was, causing? So, how do we prove that to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt?
As a prosecutor, what would need to take place? What would investigators need to do over the next few months to make this a stronger case for you, to make you more comfortable going to trial and, potentially keeping this man in prison for the rest of his life?
To state the obvious, find Suzanne's body.
Yeah.
Really, that's the biggest thing they need to do. And if that can't be done, the case is just going to be hard. Not saying it's impossible. It can be done. It's just going to be very hard.
It's a challenge, yeah. And I'm glad you pointed out, kind of on the flip side of things, since you've been in both realms, the defense side. What do you think, after looking at this, how does that affect the defense for Simpson?
There's a lot in this that doesn't look good, for sure, but is it enough? That's the biggest question. And as a defense attorney, the state has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And so that's the question. Is it enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he murdered Suzanne? I'm not sure.
And is it important for viewers, residents of the community, to realize that there's a lot of evidence that's come out? We've heard from a lot of family friends that this was an abusive relationship. She had, made some comments to her personal banker, but an abusive husband is not the same as someone that has murdered his wife and potentially hidden the remains. Being an abusive husband is not the same as being a murderer per se.
Right. One doesn't necessarily mean you did the other, right? And in this case, I believe that it will come out in trial that there was prior abuse. And is that important? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But does that absolutely mean he killed her? No.
Yeah. So a lot of things that investigators still have to do while this timeline has been spelled out, and that's, surveillance video. what they know about the purchases that Brad Simpson made that day, where he was. A lot of it is evidence in this case, but still a lot of big questions. And when we're talking about the domestic abuse side of this, that aspect of the case, because she made outcries months before she was last seen, there are some questions raised about why doesn't someone just leave? It is never that simple. That is something that we're going to talk about with Courtney Friedman, who has covered this issue for years in our community. It's one that is unfortunately very prevalent in Bexar County. So Marissa, I want to thank you for being here. I appreciate you weighing in for both, the defense side and prosecution side of things.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break. Courtney will join us on the other side. The latest on the Suzanne Simpson case, there is an aspect of this that revolves very heavily around domestic violence. It's something that we learned yesterday with all of the new information spelled out in the murder warrant for Brad Simpson. Suzanne Simpson, we now know, made an outcry months before she was last seen in August, telling her personal banker that she was a victim of abuse, that her cell phone was repeatedly taken away from her, and that if something were to happen to her, look for her in a lake. Every time I say that, I literally get chills.
Yes.
That has some people asking, if she knew this was a problem, why didn't she just leave?
Yeah.
But that is simply not, it's just not that simple, and it's not uncommon to see things like this.
Right. And, I've had an ongoing series for about 8 years now, domestic violence rampant in our community, which is why I picked this subject up. I've talked to dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of survivors locally. And I think what you said originally, too, when we talk about yelling at the Argyle or we're talking about taking someone's phone away, these are acts of abuse. And so this is something that I've been able to learn from experts over the years. Those are forms of abuse, taking you away from family, isolating, verbal abuse is abuse. And so by the time that these gradual things add up, then you may have physical abuse as well. But this has become a way of life for somebody. And we can't speak directly to this relationship because we don't know. But generally speaking, when somebody, we've heard experts say, when somebody is killed in a domestic violence situation, that is the end act of control. That is not
it's
all
not
of
the
it.
first time.
It is by far not the first time.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of what experts and advocates are working so hard, and survivors themselves are working so hard to let the community know this is not cut and dry. By the time that you're under control, by the time that you don't have access to the passcodes on your phone, this is just an example of a general thing that is very common with survivors. By that time, you don't really have control over your actions, and if things have become physical, that is an even greater threat. I often say this, and I know this is a little bit of a trigger warning because so many people have gone through this, but when you ask, why didn't you just leave? Why didn't you just leave? Why didn't she just leave the relationship? You can't really ask that. A lot of times an abuser, and I've heard this so many times, horrible, horrible things. If you leave, go ahead. If you leave, I'll kill your family. I'll kill your dog. I'll set your mom's house on fire. I mean, I know these are like really triggering things to hear, but this is some of the things that these survivors and the victims are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So it's not just cut and dry like that. There are ways that you can be there for a survivor other than saying, well, why don't you just leave if they don't leave?
We were talking about this earlier this morning. The thing to ask is, why didn't you leave? But more along the lines of, how can I help you leave?
Right.
What do you need from me?
Right.
And it may take several times asking that over and over and over again. And a stat that stuck with me that you shared was that how many times does it actually take someone on average to get out of these situations?
Yeah, so the average number of times someone in an abusive relationship will attempt to leave is 7.
7 times on average.
On average.
Meaning somebody could try to leave even more than that and still not be able to get out.
So, I mean, luckily some people, I say women and men, they can get away, but the first, second, third time they leave. But for a lot of people, I met a woman one time who almost lost her life. She was shot badly injured by her boyfriend, and she tried to leave, I think she said 12 times. And every time you try to leave, she said it would just become more and more dangerous. The threats would become, and I know this is really, and this is why I'm giving a trigger warning, because this is this example of the lake comment. Yeah. We were talking about this before, which is why we think this type of live stream conversation is so important, because some of the discussions we're having behind the scenes about why it's so important, why we tell the stories the way we tell them on KSAT, there are comments that are mentioned like that. Like somebody did say to me the same thing, like a lake. If, I told a friend.
You talked to a survivor.
I talked to a survivor.
Who said their abuser had threatened them before.
Yes.
With very specific, this is what I will do to you if you try to leave.
Right. And the specificity of, it's reminiscent of what was told to Suzanne's personal banker. It's a very similar story that has been told to me by survivors. I told my loved ones, if something happened to me, this is likely what will happen, because that was the threat that was given to me.
Yeah.
So it's something to think about when you are approaching a domestic violence survivor or somebody you think may need your help. Continue that support. So what we've learned is you just say, listen, this doesn't seem that healthy. I'm here for you. If you're not ready to leave, if you don't want to leave right now, that's fine. What do you need from me? I'm just noticing that this isn't healthy.
And you're going to have to come back and ask more than once.
Check in, but don't expect somebody to leave immediately, because that is by far the most dangerous time to leave an abusive relationship, is when typically some of the most horrendous violence or abuse happens. So, and again, speaking not specifically, we don't know the details of this relationship, but it does beg a lot of the comments, Myra, that we're getting, because I have this series, I'm constantly contacted about this situation and this topic. And a lot of people do say, with good intentions, well, why didn't she just leave? And so that's why I think it's really important to go over these types of things. And then, of course, in this affidavit, like number after number, we can go, you know.
And it's not just a question of, packing up your things and getting out safely, but you talked about that dependency. If somebody's phone is removed, think about how often, how much we depend on these to access every part of our lives. There's also sometimes a financial dependency. If I leave, what am I going to do for money? There are so many different aspects to that, and it doesn't necessarily, signal, oh, this is the way the relationship has always been. It didn't necessarily start out that way. Escalation is a key part of domestic violence.
Right, and we talk about, there is a section on this where it talks about the cell phone kind of extensively, which I think is really interesting and a good topic jumping off point, because of that sense of control that, Brad had messaged a friend that said I shouldn't have taken her phone, but XYZ, that he was very jealous and all of these things, and that's in this affidavit in writing. But it's so common that, the passcode, you don't have the passcode to your phone. We talked about financial abuse all the time in my series, where you think you can't leave because you would be homeless, right? That's why the shelters exist, to help build you back up, because people can make it very difficult for you to leave if you are dependent on them financially. You don't have access to your friends or family because that isolation happens first. The gaslighting makes you think that you can't make it on your own. There's just so much of a gradual progression to this point where it is easy for someone to say, I can't do it, and that makes complete sense. But the cell phone thing is really an interesting thing to continue to see. Taking the cell phone away, turning the cell phone off, having access to the codes that allow you to remove the cell phone from contact. That's something that I have heard. I have heard, and I think it's important that we hear these examples. I heard that sticks in my head from a wonderful survivor who made it through so much. She wasn't allowed to have access to clothing, so she was constant to clothing. She was in pajamas. All that was allowed for her was pajamas, because how can you leave the house
one more barrier
and be taken seriously, right? And ask for help if you don't even have shoes or clothes. It's such a simple thing. She went to the shelter and talked about getting her first pair of jeans in a couple years because she'd been a prisoner in her house. It's these types of things that it's not just being hit. It's not just being, when we talk about the end result being something horrific, these little things add up. And so just having this information as a society is so important, and this is starting those conversations.
And I think that is, that's a good place for us to let people know that we have a tremendous list of resources, and we're not just talking about a shelter, we're not just talking about a number to call. If you need food, if you need clothing, if you need clothes to leave your home, we have so many domestic violence resources on our website right now that will help you every single step of the way. You don't have to have a plan in your head formulated, ready to go when you call. they will help you do that.
Yeah.
Courtney, you've been a huge part of putting that together for us with all your reporting over the years. So go to ksat.com/domestic violence. Right there at the top of that page, there is a big button you can click. It gets you access to help right now. Long list of numbers to call, websites to access. So for you or a loved one, the point is there's help out there right now. Courtney, thanks for being here.
Yeah, of course.
I appreciate it.
No problem. All right.
That's the very latest on the Suzanne Simpson case. Of course, we are continuing to follow it. We'll have more information throughout the day. You can always check out ksat.com, and we'll see you at 5 and 6 o'clock.